They threw her trunk off the back of the wagon before the wheels even stopped turning, and Nora Calloway, 16 years old, with salt still crusting her eyelashes from 3 days of crying, watched her dead mother's Bible skid across the frozen mud of Harbor Ridge like it meant nothing at all. The year was 1858, and the people of that Oregon coastal town had decided that the orphan daughter of a drowned fisherman and a woman who talked to the sea had no place among decent folk. What none of them knew, what Nora herself would not discover for another 11 days, was that the shipwrecks rotting along the southern bluffs held something far more valuable than timber and barnacles. They held the architecture of her survival, and eventually the salvation of every soul who had cast her out. Elder Whitfield stood on the porch of the general store with his arms crossed, his white beard catching the November wind. Beside him, his wife pulled their 2 daughters close as though Nora carried some kind of plague. "She will not last until Christmas," Margaret Whitfield said, loud enough for Nora to hear. Her mother was the same way, talked wild, lived wild. The sea took her husband, and madness took her. Now look at what is left. Nora picked up the Bible. Its spine was cracked, but the pages held. She tucked it inside her coat against her ribs, where she could feel its weight with every breath. She had nothing else. The town council had voted the previous evening, 11-1, that the Calloway cottage and its quarter-acre would be seized to cover debts her mother had allegedly owed to the trading company. The one dissenting vote belonged to old Thomas Marsh, the retired ship captain who walked with a whalebone cane, and even he had only muttered his objection before looking away. The wind coming off the Pacific cut through her wool coat like it was made of paper. She could smell the brine, the kelp rotting along the tide line, the pine resin from the forests that climbed the bluffs to the east. November, on the Oregon coast, was not winter the way the prairies knew winter. It was something wetter, something that crawled into your bones and stayed. The real storms would come in December and January, and when they came, they would bring waves tall enough to rearrange the shoreline. Nora turned south. She did not look back at the town. She had no plan, no destination, only the vague memory of something her father had told her years ago, before his boat went down in the squall of '54. "There is a place past Broken Point," he had said once, mending a net by lantern light while she sat cross-legged on the floor. "The rocks make a kind of room there, warm even when the wind is howling. Your grandfather sheltered there once during the big blow of '39. She did not know if the place was real. She did not know she could find it, but she walked south along the bluff trail because south was the only direction that did not lead back to people who had decided she was worthless. The trail narrowed after 2 miles. The forest pressed close on the left, all Sitka spruce and Douglas fir, their trunks furred with moss so thick it looked like green velvet. On the right, the bluff dropped 100 feet to the rocky shore below. She could hear the waves hammering the base of the cliffs, a sound so deep and constant it vibrated in her chest. Gulls wheeled overhead, screaming at her like they too wanted her gone. By the time she reached Broken Point, the light was failing. The November sun set early here, dropping behind a wall of clouds that turned the ocean the color of lead. Her fingers were numb. Her boots were soaked through from the trail mud. She had not eaten since the previous morning when Mrs. Chilton at the boarding house had given her a biscuit and a look of pity before locking the door. Broken Point was aptly named. The bluff fractured here into a jumble of basalt shelves and sea stacks, the rock dark and jagged where the ocean had been chewing at it for 10,000 years. Below, in the failing light, she could see the remains of at least 3 ships. Their ribs jutted from the rocks like the skeletons of enormous animals. Planking, masts, rusted iron fittings, all tangled with kelp and driftwood in a graveyard of failed voyages. One wreck was old, so old the wood had turned silver. Another was newer, its hull still showing traces of red paint, and there, tucked into the base of the bluff where a fold in the basalt created a deep overhang, she saw the opening. It was barely 4 feet wide, framed by rock on 3 sides and partially hidden by a curtain of dried seagrass. She almost missed it entirely, but the last of the daylight caught something inside. A faint gleam, and curiosity pulled her forward when exhaustion told her to lie down and give up. She crawled through the opening on her hands and knees, the rocks scraping her palms, the smell of earth and mineral water replacing the salt wind. The passage went back about 8 feet, narrow enough that her shoulders brushed both sides, and then it opened. Nora stood up in darkness. She could not see the space, but she could feel it. The air was different here, warmer still, carrying a faint sulfur smell that reminded her of the hot springs her father had once described further inland. She reached out, and her fingers found smooth rock on one side, then nothing, then rock again. A chamber. She stamped her foot, and the echo told her the ceiling was high, maybe 10 or 12 feet. And the warmth. After hours in the cutting coastal wind, the warmth was so startling that she thought she was imagining it. But it was real. The rock beneath her boots was warm, not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm. Somewhere below this chamber, deep in the volcanic bones of the coast, geothermal heat was bleeding upward through the basalt. Her father had been right. The rocks made a kind of room, and the room was warm. She sank to the floor and pressed her palms flat against the stone. Tears came then, the first ones that were not from grief but from something else entirely. Relief, perhaps, or the first fragile stirring of something she had not felt since her mother died in September. Purpose. She would not die at Broken Point. She would live here. That first night, she slept on bare rock with her coat bundled under her head and the Bible pressed against her stomach. She woke in the gray pre-dawn light that filtered through the cave entrance and took her first real look at the place that would become her home. The chamber was roughly oval, perhaps 20 feet long and 15 wide. The ceiling was a natural dome of dark basalt streaked with veins of white quartz that caught the dim light and scattered it. Along the back wall, a thin sheet of water seeped from a crack in the rock, ran down the face of a stone in a glistening curtain, and collected in a natural basin about 2 feet across. You touched the water. It was warm, almost bath temperature, and it smelled faintly of iron and sulfur. Drinkable, she hoped. She would have to test it carefully. But the chamber was bare. No fuel for fire. No food. No bedding. The warm rock and the mineral spring would keep her alive for a few days, but without shelter improvements and food stores, December would kill her just as surely as the town had predicted. That first morning, Nora climbed down the bluff to the shipwreck graveyard. What she found changed everything. The wrecks were not just debris. They were a lumberyard, a hardware store, and a general mercantile all tangled together on the rocks. The newer ship, the one with red paint, still had much of its deck planking intact, good solid oak 4 inches thick, warped by salt water, but still strong. She found coils of rope, some rotted but some serviceable. Iron nails by the hundreds, rusted but usable after cleaning. Glass from portholes, unbroken. Canvas from a collapsed sail, stiff with salt but whole. And in what had been the captain's cabin of the oldest wreck, now open to the sky like a roofless room, she found a cast-iron stove no bigger than a milk pail, designed for a small ship's galley, still bolted to a fragment of decking. She sat among the wreckage with the morning tide swirling around her boots and laughed for the first time in months. It was a strange sound, thin and rusty, swallowed by the crash of waves. But it was real. The work began that day and did not stop. She could not carry the stove up the bluff alone. It weighed at least 80 pounds. So she built a sled from deck planking and rope, and she dragged it up the narrow trail she carved into the bluff face with a salvage marlinspike, switchbacking through the rocks, gaining elevation one brutal foot at a time. It took her 2 full days. By the time she muscled the stove through the cave entrance, her hands were bleeding and her shoulders felt like they had been pulled from their sockets. But the stove was inside. She built a chimney from the stove to a natural fissure she discovered near the top of the chamber, a crack in the basalt that vented upward through the rock to the surface. She packed the gaps around the stovepipe with a mixture of clay from the bluff face and dried seagrass, a technique she remembered from watching her mother seal the cracks in their cottage walls every autumn. The clay mixture, when it dried against the warm rock, set hard as brick. For fuel, she harvested driftwood from the beach below. The salt in it made it spit and crackle, so she learned to soak the wood in the fresh water seep for 2 days before burning it, leaching out enough salt to make the burn cleaner. She stacked her fuel supply in the passage entrance, where the airflow kept it drying. She built a door for the cave entrance from shit's planking hung on rope hinges, and she caulked the gaps with oakum she picked from the old rope, just as shipwrights did when sealing hull seams. The cave went from drafty to snug in a single afternoon. For a bed, she stuffed a canvas sail bag with dried bracken fern from the forest above, then laid it on a platform of planking raised 6 inches off the cave floor. She positioned it directly over the warmest section of rock, where the geothermal heat was strongest. That first night on the bracken bed, with the stove glowing and the warm rock radiating beneath her, she slept so deeply she did not hear the storm that lashed the coast until dawn. Food was the hardest problem. She set snares in the forest for rabbits using wire salvaged from the ship rigging. She gathered mussels and sea urchins from the tidal pools below during low tide, prying them from the rocks with a flat piece of iron. She found a patch of wild camas root on the bluff meadow and dug enough to fill a canvas sack, roasting them in the coals of her stove until they turned sweet as honey. She dried strips of rabbit meat over the stove on a rack made from copper wire, preserving them for the days when storms would make hunting impossible. And then there was the confessional. It began by accident. The cave had a peculiar acoustic quality. The curved basalt walls and the domed ceiling created something Nora did not have a word for. A resonance that took her whispered words and held them, amplified them, sent them circling the chamber before they faded. When she spoke to herself, which she did often in those lonely weeks, the cave spoke back. Not an echo exactly, but a deepening, as though the rock itself were listening and considering her words before releasing them. She began talking to the cave the way other people talk to God. She whispered her fears. She whispered her grief over her mother, who had wasted away through the summer with a fever no doctor in Harbor Ridge would treat, because treating the Calloway woman was beneath their dignity. She whispered her fury at Elder Whitfield, at Margaret, at the 11 men who had voted to take her home. She whispered the name of the boy she had loved in secret, Daniel Marsh, grandson of old Thomas, who had stood in the crowd the day she was cast out and said nothing. The cave held every word, and Nora found that whispering her pain to the warm stone was the closest thing to peace she had ever known. She named it her confessional. She built a small bench from salvaged teak directly beneath the center of the dome, where the acoustics were strongest, and she sat there in the evenings after her work was done, and she whispered the things she could not say to any living soul. Word of the cave girl reached Harbor Ridge within 2 weeks. A trapper named Colburn spotted smoke rising from the bluff near Broken Point and followed it to the fisher vent. He peered down through the crack but could not see the chamber below. He reported it at the tavern that evening, and the stories spread the way all stories spread in small towns, growing stranger with each telling. "She is living in a hole in the ground like an animal," Margaret Whitfield said at the church social. Her mother was mad. "The girl is worse." Elder Whitfield predicted she would come crawling back before the solstice, begging for charity, and they would have to deal with her then. She did not come crawling back. December passed, the storms came, enormous Pacific systems that drove rain sideways and turned the forest trails to rivers. Nara stayed warm. The geothermal rock beneath her chamber held steady at nearly 60 degrees regardless of what the sky was doing. Her stove kept the air above comfortable. Her caulked door held against the wind. She had smoked rabbit, dried camas root, and a seemingly endless supply of mussels. She was eating better than some families in Harbor Ridge. In January, she made a discovery that transformed the cave from shelter into something more. While exploring a narrow passage at the back of the chamber, she found a second cavity, smaller than the first, with a pool of geothermal water deep enough to sit in. The water was a steady 102 degrees, clear, slightly mineralized, and it flowed continuously from a crack in the wall and drained through a gap in the floor. A natural hot spring bath, hidden inside the bluff, fed by the same volcanic system that warmed her floor. She wept in that water. She soaked her aching muscles and her cracked hands and she wept with gratitude for a planet that could be simultaneously so cruel on its surface and so generous in its hidden places. She improved the passage between the chambers, widening it with patience and a ship's chisel, and she lined the hot spring room with flat stones to make the floor comfortable. She built a shelf for soap she made from rendered rabbit fat and wood ash lye. She hung her clothes to dry on a line of copper wire strung across the warm air rising from the pool. By February, Nora Calloway, the girl they said would not survive until Christmas, had built something no one in Harbor Ridge could have imagined. A warm, dry, insulated dwelling inside the living rock. A food supply that would carry her through spring. A bathing chamber that European royalty would have envied. And a confessional where she sat each evening and whispered to the stone the story of her own unlikely persistence. But February on the Oregon coast in 1859 was not finished with anyone. The storm that struck on the 23rd of February had no official name. In the years that followed, the people of Harbor Ridge would simply call it the Great Blow. It began as a low-pressure system off the Aleutian Islands and gathered strength as it drove south and east across the open Pacific, absorbing moisture and fury for over 1,000 miles. By the time it reached the Oregon coast, it carried sustained winds of nearly 90 miles per hour and rain so dense it reduced visibility to zero. The first sign was the barometric drop. Nora felt it in her ears before she saw it in the sky, a pressure change that made her sinuses ache and sent the seabirds inland in screaming flocks. She had been watching the weather for months now, learning its language the way her father had, and she knew this was different. This was not a December squall or a January front. This was something that came perhaps once in a generation. She spent the morning of the 23rd securing everything she could. She carried extra fuel inside. She checked her door caulking. She wedged additional planking over the entrance and braced it with timber. She filled every container she had with fresh water from the mineral seep in case the flow was disrupted, and then she retreated to her confessional bench and waited. The storm hit Harbor Ridge at 4 in the afternoon. The wind came first, a sound like a locomotive running through the forest, snapping Sitka spruce-like matchsticks. Then the rain, horizontal, mixed with salt spray from waves that reached heights of 40 feet. The ocean invaded the harbor. It lifted boats from their moorings and threw them against the pier with a sound that people later compared to cannon fire. The pier itself, built of old-growth timber and iron bolts, held for perhaps 20 minutes before the surge tore it apart. Elder Whitfield's house lost its roof at 5:30. The wind peeled it back like the lid of a tin can, exposing the parlor where his family huddled around a fireplace that was suddenly useless against rain falling straight down into the room. The Chilton boarding house lost its eastern wall. 3 houses on the waterfront were simply gone by nightfall, carried away by surge and wind, their foundations scoured to bare rock. The temperature dropped as the storm's cold core arrived. 38 degrees, 34, 31. The rain turned to sleet, then to a wet, heavy snow that stuck to everything and added weight to structures already compromised by wind damage. Roofs that had survived the gale collapsed under the snow load. The general store's front porch gave way, blocking the door and trapping the Marsh family inside. By midnight, Harbor Ridge was broken. 23 of its 31 structures were damaged or destroyed. No one was dead yet, but hypothermia was settling over the town like a second storm. Families huddled in whatever shelter remained, burning furniture for heat, the wind howling through gaps where walls had been. Children cried. Livestock that had not been sheltered were already dying in the fields. And at Broken Point, 3 miles south, Nora Calloway sat on her confessional bench in a chamber that held steady at 58 degrees. Her stove burned quietly. The mineral water seeped down the wall undisturbed. The geothermal heat rose through the basalt floor the same way it had risen for 10,000 years, indifferent to the apocalypse raging above. The wind screamed across the top of the bluff, but the cave entrance faced south and east, sheltered from the northwest gale by the mass of the point itself. Her planking door rattled, but held. A thin draft found its way through the caulking, cold and wet. but the chamber was so thoroughly insulated by 10 feet of solid rock on all sides that it barely affected the temperature. She could hear the storm. She could feel the ground shudder when the biggest waves struck the base of the bluff. But she was warm. She was dry. She was alive. She whispered to the stone that night. She whispered for the people of Harbor Ridge, even the ones who had thrown her trunk in the mud and called her mother mad. She whispered for Margaret Whitfield's 2 daughters, who had once been her classmates and who were now somewhere in the ruin of that roofless house. She whispered for Daniel Marsh, trapped in the general store with his grandfather. She whispered, and the cave held her words, and the storm raged on. The great blow lasted 31 hours. When it finally exhausted itself on the morning of the 25th, it left behind a town that looked like it had been shelled by artillery. Snow lay 2 feet deep on the wreckage. The harbor was unrecognizable. Trees were down across every trail. And the people of Harbor Ridge, emerging from their shattered homes into a silence so total it hurt their ears, faced a terrible arithmetic. It was still February. More storms would come. They had lost most of their shelter, much of their food supply, and nearly all of their firewood, which had been soaked or scattered by the surge. It was old Thomas Marsh who thought of the girl. He stood in the wreckage of the general store, leaning on his whalebone cane, his white hair wild, a cut on his forehead crusted with dried blood. His grandson Daniel stood beside him, and it was to Daniel that he spoke. "Bat Calloway girl," Thomas said. "She went south, toward Broken Point. If she found what her daddy found, she might be the only one on this whole coast who still has a roof." Daniel looked at his grandfather. "She is probably dead," he said, and his voice cracked when he said it. Thomas Marsh shook his head. "Her daddy was a survivor. Her mama was stronger than any of you ever gave her credit for. If the girl has half of either one of them in her, she is sitting warm right now while we stand here freezing." They organized a party. 12 people, including Elder Whitfield, who no longer had a house or a store of opinions about who belonged in his town. They walked the 3 miles south, through down timber and drifted snow, following the bluff trail where it was passable and cutting through the forest where it was not. The journey took nearly 4 hours in conditions that left them staggering with cold. Colburn the trapper led them. He remembered the smoke from the fissure. When they reached the bluff above Broken Point, they stopped and stared. Below them, in the jumble of basalt and shipwreck timber, they could see a thin line of smoke rising from a crack in the rock. And at the base of the bluff, partially hidden by seagrass, they could see a door. An actual door, built from ship's planking, fitted into the rock face as neatly as any door in Harbor Ridge. Nora heard them coming. She heard the crunch of boots on the frozen trail, the murmur of voices, the heavy breathing of people exhausted by cold and effort. She opened the door before they knocked. 12 people stood on the ledge outside her cave. Their faces were raw from wind. Their clothes were soaked and freezing stiff. Margaret Whitfield was among them, holding her 2 daughters against her body, and her eyes were not proud anymore. They were terrified. Nora looked at them for a long moment. The wind cut across the ledge, and she watched them flinch from it. "Come inside," she said. They came. They filed through the narrow entrance passage one at a time, and as each person entered the chamber, they stopped. The warmth hit them first, that impossible steady warmth rising from the living rock. Then the smell, mineral water and wood smoke and dried herbs, the smell of a home. Then the sight of it, the stove glowing, the bracken bed neat against the wall, the shelves stocked with dried meat and roasted camas root, the water running clear and warm down the back wall, the quartz veins catching the firelight and scattering it like stars. Margaret Whitfield sank to her knees on the warm stone floor and wept. Her daughters pressed against her, already warming, their shivers slowing as the geothermal heat seeped into their small bodies through the rock. Elder Whitfield stood near the entrance, his mouth open, his certainty shattered. He looked at the 16-year-old girl who had built this place from shipwrecks and stubbornness, and he could not find a single word. Old Thomas Marsh lowered himself onto the confessional bench, leaned his whalebone cane against the wall, and smiled. Your daddy would be proud, he said quietly. Over the next 3 days, Nora Calloway sheltered 37 people in her cave and the surrounding rock formations. She showed them the hot spring chamber, where the injured and the youngest children were kept warm in the 102-degree water. She rationed her food supply and organized foraging parties for mussels and clams during low tide, teaching the town's men and women how to read the tidal pools the way her father had taught her. She showed them how to dry driftwood using the geothermal heat, stacking it on the warm rock floor near the chamber walls where the temperature was highest, producing usable fuel in hours instead of days. When the second storm came on the 28th, weaker than the great blow, but still dangerous, 37 people sat in Nora's chambers and listened to the wind howl harmlessly above them. The children played on the warm floor. Someone found an old fiddle string in the shipwreck debris and strung it on a piece of driftwood and played a tune so thin and wavering it made everyone laugh and then made everyone cry. Daniel Marsh brought Nora a cup of hot mineral water that evening and stood beside her near the cave entrance, watching the storm through a gap in the planking. I should have said something, he told her. The day they made you leave, I should have stood up. Nora took the cup. The water was warm in her hands. She could feel the steam on her face, could smell the iron and sulfur that she had come to associate with safety. You are here now, she said. That is what matters. He looked at her in the firelight, and she could see that something had broken open in him, some wall that small towns build inside their children to keep them from questioning the cruelty of consensus. The rebuilding of Harbor Ridge began in March. But it did not begin the way anyone expected. Instead of simply repairing the old town on its exposed waterfront location, old Thomas March proposed something radical. They would incorporate what Nora had taught them. They would build a community shelter into the bluff face, using the same geothermal warmth, the same principles of natural rock insulation, the same shipwreck salvage techniques. A place that no storm could touch. Not to replace their homes, but to ensure that no future blow could ever leave them as helpless as the great blow had. Elder Whitfield seconded the proposal. He did so quietly, without meeting Nora's eyes, but he did it. And when the vote came, it was unanimous, 37-0. They called it the Calloway Shelter. Nora supervised the construction, teaching skills she had learned alone through trial and error. How to identify geothermally active rock by its temperature and mineral staining. How to caulk with oakum and clay. How to build ventilation channels using natural fissures. How to create a chimney draft that would draw smoke upward even in high winds. How to use the warm rock floor for drying and preserving food. The shelter took 4 months to complete. It could hold 80 people. It had a hot spring pool, a communing cooking area with 2 salvage ship stoves, and storage for enough preserved food to sustain the town through a 2-week siege of weather. The entrance was reinforced with double planking and could be sealed against surge. On the day it was finished, in July of 1859, the town gathered inside for a dedication. The chamber smelled of fresh-cut timber and warm rock. Light came through quartz fissures in the ceiling, painting the walls with pale gold. Margaret Whitfield stood before the group and spoke. We sent a child into the wilderness, she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. And the wilderness sent back a teacher. Nora stood near the back of the chamber, near the spot where her original confessional bench still sat beneath the acoustic dome. She did not speak during the ceremony. She was not a person who needed to be heard by crowds. She was a person who whispered to stone and let the stone hold what mattered. But later that evening, when the town had gone home and the shelter stood empty and warm in the summer twilight, she sat on her bench one final time. She pressed her palms against the rock the way she had on that first desperate night in November. The stone was warm. It was always warm. It had been warm for 10,000 years before she arrived and would be warm for 10,000 years after she was gone. She whispered one last confession to the cave. She said, I forgive them, and she meant it, not because they deserved it, but because carrying the weight of their cruelty was heavier than dragging an 80-pound stove up a basalt bluff and she was tired of carrying things that did not serve her. The cave held her words, the quartz veins glittered, and somewhere deep in the volcanic bones of the Oregon coast, the earth went on generating warmth the way it always had, patient and indifferent, and generous beyond any human understanding. Years later, when Nora Calloway was an old woman with white hair and hands still strong from a lifetime of building, travelers would sometimes find their way to Broken Point and ask to see the famous shelter. She would show them the chamber, the hot spring, the confessional bench, and she would tell them something that she had learned at 16, alone in the cave with nothing but shipwrecks and stubbornness and a Bible with a cracked spine. The earth does not care who you are, she would say. It does not care if you are loved or hated, rich or poor, welcome or cast out. It will warm you just the same. The question is whether you are humble enough to press your hands to the ground and accept what it offers. They always left Broken Point quietly after she said that. They walked north along the bluff trail toward Harbor Ridge, past the shelter that bore her name, past the rebuilt pier and the new harbor wall in the town that had learned, in the worst way possible, that the people they throw away are sometimes the only ones who know how to save them. And if they listened carefully, over the sound of the waves and the wind in the Sitka spruce, they could almost hear it, a whisper rising from the warm rock, held there by the stone for anyone patient enough to listen. The voice of a girl who built a cathedral from wreckage and forgave the world from inside it.